I was already 22 when my father's friend invited me to his house, old enough to make my own choices, yet still young enough to feel uncertain about where I belonged. At that point in my life, I was living away from home for college, trying to understand myself in a world that often felt louder than my thoughts. My father had always been a steady figure, and so had Daniel, his longtime friend. Daniel had been around since I was a kid, the kind of man who spoke calmly, listened carefully, and never rushes words. To me, he was someone I respected, nothing more. The invitation itself seemed harmless. Daniel was working on a small personal project and mentioned that he could use some help over the weekend. My father thought it would be good for me, experience, conversation, a break from my routine. I agreed without hesitation, not realizing how much that simple decision would stay with me. That Daniel's house was quiet, tucked away in a peaceful neighborhood. When I arrived, he welcomed me warmly, the same way he always had. There was no awkwardness, no strange energy, just familiarity. We spent the afternoon talking about school, work, and life in general. He asked thoughtful questions, the kind that made me feel seen rather than judged. It was rare for someone his age to speak to me like an equal, and I found myself opening up more than usual as evening settled in. The house felt even quieter. We cooked dinner together, laughing at small mistakes and sharing stories. Daniel talked about his career, the choices he'd made, and the moments he wished he'd understood himself better. I listened closely, not just to his words, but to the pauses between them. There was a sense of honesty in the room that felt new to me. At one point, he asked how I was really doing. Not the polite version people usually expect, but the truth. I hesitated, then admitted that I often felt confused about my future and about myself. I didn't go into details, but he seemed to understand anyway. He didn't offer advice right away. He just listened. That simple act made something shift inside me. Later, when the conversation slowed, I realized how comfortable I felt sitting there with him. It surprised me. I'd always been cautious around people, careful not to reveal too much. Yet with Daniel, the walls I'd built felt less necessary. Still, I reminded myself who he was, my father's friend, someone I should respect, someone whose life was already full and complicated in ways I didn't fully know. When night came, Daniel showed me the guest room. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind replayed the day. Nothing inappropriate had happened. Nothing had crossed a line. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had begun. Not something physical, not something spoken aloud, but something emotional and unexpected. I felt a mix of gratitude and unease. Gratitude for being understood, for feeling less alone. Unease because I didn't know where those feelings belonged. I told myself it was just admiration, just the comfort of being heard by someone older and wiser. Still, my thoughts kept circling back, and sleep came slowly. The next morning, sunlight filled the house, and everything seemed normal again. Over breakfast, we talked casually, as if the deeper conversations of the night before were just another part of life. But I noticed small things, the way he paid attention when I spoke, the quiet kindness in his expressions. I wondered if he noticed the same shift I felt or if it existed only in my mind as the day went on. I tried to focus on the work we were supposed to do, but my thoughts wandered. I knew I was standing at the edge of something unfamiliar. I didn't know what it meant yet, only that it made me question myself in ways I hadn't expected. By the end of that first day, I understood one thing clearly. Accepting that invitation had changed how I saw Daniel and how I saw myself. I didn't know where those feelings would lead, or if they should lead anywhere at all. All I knew was that this was only the beginning, and whatever came next would test my sense of right and wrong in ways I wasn't prepared for. The second day at Daniel's house began quietly, but the stillness felt different now, heavier somehow. I woke up earlier than planned, my mind already full of thoughts I hadn't invited. As I stepped into the kitchen, Daniel was there, making coffee, moving with the ease of someone who knew the space well. He smiled when he saw me, the same familiar smile, yet it carried a warmth that made me look away for a moment. That we spent the morning working side by side. There was a natural rhythm between us, an unspoken understanding of who would do what next. Every now and then, our conversations drifted away from the task and into more personal territory. Daniel talked about his younger years, about dreams he once had, and how life slowly reshaped them. I listened carefully, sensing that these weren't stories he shared often. At one point, he admitted that adulthood hadn't turned out the way he expected. He spoke about responsibility, about doing what was right even when it meant putting parts of yourself aside. His words stayed with me. I wondered if he realized how deeply they resonated with my own fears, how often I felt caught between who I was and who I was expected to be. As the afternoon passed, I noticed how comfortable we'd become around each other. The conversations flowed without effort, and silence no longer felt awkward. It was in those quiet moments that I felt the strongest pull, a feeling I didn't want to name. I kept reminding myself that this connection had limits, that it needed to stay where it was. Still, emotions don't always listen to reason. Later, while we took a break, Daniel asked me about relationships. The question caught me off guard. I answered honestly, but carefully, sharing that I'd never really felt understood in that part of my life. He didn't push for details, but his expression softened, as if he sensed more beneath my words. For a moment, it felt like we were both standing on the edge of something neither of us wanted to step into. That evening, the house felt warmer, filled with the quiet hum of conversation and shared space. We talked about books, music, and the small choices that shape who we become. Daniel mentioned his spouse briefly, with respect and familiarity, and the mention grounded me. It reminded me that his life wasn't a blank page. It was already written in many ways. That realization brought a wave of guilt I hadn't expected. As night fell, our conversation slowed. We sat in the living room, the lights dim, the air calm. There was a moment when Daniel looked at me, really looked at me, and I felt seen in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. No words were spoken, but the silence carried weight. I wondered if he felt the same tension, the same unspoken awareness that I excused myself soon after, retreating to the guest room. Lying in the dark, I replayed every interaction, every glance, every pause. I told myself this was just confusion, a passing feeling brought on by closeness and honesty. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I was developing feelings I hadn't planned for, feelings that came with responsibility and risk. The next morning, I woke up determined to regain control. I acted normal, keeping conversations light, reminding myself of boundaries. Daniel seemed more reserved too, as if he were doing the same. There was a shared understanding that something needed to remain unsaid. That'd be why the time the weekend was halfway over, I realized how fragile the situation was. What had started as a simple visit had turned into an emotional test. I didn't know where it would lead, or if it should lead anywhere at all. All I knew was that the bond forming between us, quiet, complicated, and unplanned, was growing stronger, and with it came a responsibility neither of us could ignore. By the third day, the atmosphere between us had changed in a way that was impossible to ignore. Nothing dramatic had happened, yet everything felt different. The comfort was still there, but now it carried a quiet tension, like a question neither of us dared to ask out loud. I found myself watching Daniel more closely, his expressions, the way he paused before speaking, the careful distance he seemed to maintain, that we spent most of the day finishing the work we'd planned to do. It should have been routine, but every small interaction felt charged with meaning. When our hands reached for the same object, or when our eyes met unexpectedly, I felt my heart race, followed immediately by guilt. I kept reminding myself that this situation was complicated, that real lives and real responsibilities were involved. In the afternoon, Daniel suggested we take a walk to clear our heads. The weather was calm, the sky overcast in a way that made everything feel muted and reflective. We walked side by side, not too close, not too far apart. For a while, we talked about ordinary things, but eventually the conversation slowed and silence filled the space between us. Daniel was the one who finally spoke. He said he felt conflicted, that the weekend had brought up emotions he hadn't expected. His voice was steady, but there was honesty in it that made my chest tighten. He made it clear that he wasn't blaming me, that these feelings were his responsibility. Hearing that brought a strange mix of relief and fear that I admitted that I felt the same confusion. I told him I respected him and my father too much to take this lightly. Saying those words out loud made everything feel real, no longer just thoughts in my head. We both stopped walking, standing there quietly, aware that this moment mattered. There was no rush, no dramatic gesture. Just two people acknowledging something difficult. Daniel said that whatever we felt, it had to be handled carefully, with integrity. I nodded, knowing he was right, even though part of me wished things were simpler. When we returned to the house, the mood was subdued. We kept our distance, each lost in our own thoughts. That evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, the silence felt heavier than before. Finally, Daniel spoke again, saying that honesty mattered more than comfort. He admitted that the emotional closeness between us had crossed a line for him, even if nothing physical had happened. Hearing that was painful, but also grounding. It forced me to confront the reality of the situation. I realized that what made this so intense wasn't action, but intention, the feelings we were trying not to name. In that moment, I understood how easy it is for boundaries to blur when emotions are involved. Later that night, we talked once more, calmly and carefully. There was no drama, no raised voices. Just two people trying to do the right thing in a complicated situation. We agreed that whatever connection had formed couldn't continue in the same way. It wasn't fair to his family, to my father, or to ourselves. When I went to bed, I felt a deep sense of sadness, but also clarity. I knew that acknowledging the truth was better than pretending nothing had changed. The feelings didn't disappear, but they were placed where they belonged, recognized but restrained. The next morning, I packed my things earlier than planned. Daniel helped me load my bag into the car. Our conversation polite but gentle. Before I left, he thanked me for my honesty and wished me well. There was a sense of finality in his words, not coldness, but acceptance. As I drove away, I reflected on everything that had happened. I hadn't gone there expecting anything more than a simple visit, yet I was leaving with a deeper understanding of myself. I realized that emotional choices can be just as powerful as physical ones, and that maturity sometimes means stepping back, even when your heart wants to move forward. I didn't know how long it would take to fully process what I felt, but I knew one thing for certain. That weekend had taught me the importance of boundaries, responsibility, and self-respect. And while the experience was painful, it was also a turning point, one that would stay with me long after I left Daniel's house behind. The days after I left Daniel's house felt strangely quiet, as if the world had lowered its volume while I tried to make sense of everything. I returned to my routine, classes, assignments, casual conversations with friends, but nothing felt completely normal. My thoughts kept drifting back to that weekend, not to any single moment, but to the emotions that had surfaced so unexpectedly. I found myself avoiding calls from home more than usual. It wasn't that my father had done anything wrong. It was the guilt I carried that made every conversation feel heavier. Hearing his voice reminded me of the trust he had in Daniel and, by extension, in me. That realization forced me to look inward and ask whether I had lived up to that trust emotionally, even if nothing physical had happened. Daniel and I exchanged a few messages during that time, each one careful and measured. The warmth that once filled our conversations was replaced with a respectful distance. In one message, he apologized for any confusion or discomfort the situation had caused. I responded by taking responsibility for my own feelings. There was relief in that honesty, even though it came with sadness. As the weeks passed, the intensity of my emotions began to shift. What once felt overwhelming slowly turned into reflection. I started to understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just attraction. It was a longing to be understood and accepted at a time when I felt uncertain about my identity. Daniel had been a mirror for feelings I hadn't fully acknowledged before. This realization didn't erase the complexity of the situation, but helped me place it in context. I began to see the experience as a lesson rather than a mistake. It taught me how easily emotional connections can grow when two people are vulnerable and how important it is to recognize when those connections need boundaries. Point one evening, I finally spoke to a close friend about what I've been going through without sharing names or details. Saying it out loud helped more than I expected. My friend reminded me that confusion doesn't make someone a bad person, it makes them human. That simple reassurance allowed me to breathe a little easier. Eventually, Daniel and I agreed that it was best to limit contact for a while. Not out of anger or fear, but out of respect. Letting go wasn't easy, but it felt necessary. I could sense that he was trying to focus on his own life and responsibilities, just as I needed to focus on mine. With time, the guilt softened into understanding. I learned to forgive myself for feelings I hadn't chosen, while still holding myself accountable for how I responded to them. That balance was something I'd never had to practice before. By the end of that period, I felt calmer, more grounded. The experience had forced me to confront parts of myself I'd been avoiding, and in doing so, it pushed me toward growth. I knew the story wasn't over yet, not because something more would happen between us, but because I was still learning from it. Looking back, I realized that sometimes the hardest lessons come not from dramatic actions, but from quiet moments of choice. Choosing honesty over comfort, distance over desire, and self-respect over temporary relief. Those choices don't always feel rewarding at first, but they shape who we become. As I moved forward, I carried that understanding with me, knowing that whatever came next in my life, I would face it with greater awareness and care. Time has a way of softening memories without erasing their meaning. Months passed, and the intensity of what I felt slowly settled into something quieter, something I could carry without pain. Life moved forward, and so did I. I focused on my studies, my goals, and the small moments that reminded me who I was becoming. The experience with Daniel no longer felt like an open wound, but like a chapter that had taught me something important. Eventually, I heard from Daniel again. It wasn't unexpected, but it wasn't sudden either. His message was brief and thoughtful, checking in and wishing me well. There was no hint of unresolved emotion, only kindness and respect. I replied in the same tone, grateful that we could acknowledge each other without reopening old feelings. That exchange felt like closure in the truest sense. Not long after, I visited my family. Sitting across from my father at the dinner table, listening to his stories and laughter, I felt a deep sense of clarity. I understood more clearly than ever how important trust and honesty are, not just in actions, but in intentions. I didn't share my story with him. It wasn't necessary. What mattered was that I had learned to honor the relationships in my life by respecting their boundaries. As I continued to explore my identity, I did so with more confidence. The confusion I once felt had given way to acceptance. I learned that understanding who you are doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds through experiences, reflection, and sometimes difficult choices. That weekend had been one of those defining moments for me, that I also came to understand that love, in its healthiest form, never asks you to compromise your values. What I felt wasn't wrong in itself, but acting on it would have caused harm. Recognizing that difference was a sign of growth I hadn't expected for myself. In time, I met new people. Connections build on openness and equality, without secrecy or imbalance. Those relationships felt different, lighter, because they were rooted in honesty from the start. I carried the lessons from the past with me, using them to guide my choices rather than weigh me down. Looking back now, I don't regret that weekend. I respect it for what it was, a moment of emotional awakening that taught me about responsibility, restraint, and self-respect. It showed me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step away. Even when feelings are real, that if there's one truth I've learned, it's that growth often comes from choosing what's right over what's easy. My story isn't about scandal or secrets. It's about learning to navigate emotions with integrity. And in doing so, I found a stronger, more honest version of myself. That's why I share this story now, not to dwell on the past, but to acknowledge how it shaped me. Some connections are meant to teach us, not stay with us forever. And sometimes, letting go is the very thing that allows us to move forward with peace.